In the summer of 1888, a small advertisement appeared in several London newspapers. It was brief, it was polite, it offered no money, it explained almost nothing about its purpose. It simply asked members of the public, whoever they were, wherever they lived, whatever they did for a living, if they would be willing to visit a small laboratory at the South Kensington Museum and allow a gentleman scientist to press their fingertips, one by one, onto an ink pad and then onto a card. The gentleman scientist in question was Francis Galton. He was 66 years old, famously wealthy, famously eccentric, and at this particular moment in his long career, famously obsessed with something that almost no one else in Victorian England had yet thought about at all. He believed that the patterns on the tips of human fingers contained information. Not general information, not the kind of vague physiological data that interested most scientists of his era. Specific information, individual information. The kind of information that distinguished one human being from every other human being who had ever lived, or ever would live, expressed in a set of tiny ridges and whorls that most people had been rubbing against things all their lives without ever pausing to look at them. People came. Not in enormous numbers. This was Victorian London, and visiting a scientist's laboratory to have your fingers inked was not an obvious way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. But they came. Office workers, school teachers, a retired soldier, the occasional aristocrat who found Galton's work interesting enough to make the journey, workers from the nearby exhibition halls, children whose parents had been persuaded that this was educational. Each of them sat down across from Galton or from his assistant. Each of them had their fingers rolled carefully onto the ink pad, left hand, right hand, each finger in sequence, and then rolled onto the card. Each card was labeled with whatever information about the person Galton had managed to collect: age, sex, occupation, and a few other measurements that were part of a larger project he was simultaneously running. Then the person left, never thinking about it again, and the card went into a box. Over 20 years, Galton collected 8,000 of these cards. Look at your own fingertips for a moment. The ridges are there, the loops, the whorls, the arches. You've left impressions of them on everything you've touched today, on every glass and door handle and surface your hands have encountered. Francis Galton was the man who first looked at these patterns and understood with the clarity of a genuinely original mind that they were neither random nor universal. They were both unique and permanent. No two people have the same fingerprints, and your fingerprints today are identical to your fingerprints at birth and will be identical to your fingerprints at death. This fact had always been true. Galton was the first person to prove it. The story of how he proved it, and what he did with his 8,000 cards, and what became of the collection after his death, is one of the stranger and more interesting stories in the history of science. It is the story of a man who spent 20 years building something whose importance he understood intellectually, but could not quite convert into practical reality, who got to the door of one of the most consequential discoveries in metaphysical contrary patter, the history of law enforcement, pushed it open a few inches, and then left it for someone else to walk through. It is also the story of those 8,000 strangers, their names on the cards, their fingers on the ink pad, their small acts of participation in a project they did not understand, contributing to something that would, eventually, change the world in ways that none of them could have imagined. Before we can understand what Galton did with fingerprints, we need to understand what kind of man he was, because Francis Galton was not a simple figure, and the fingerprint project was not a simple project, and the full picture, including the parts that are admirable and the parts that are troubling, is necessary to make sense of why he spent 20 years pressing strangers' fingers onto cards. He was born in 1822 into a family of extraordinary intellectual achievement. His grandfather on one side was Erasmus Darwin, the physician and natural philosopher whose ideas anticipated his grandson Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in ways that historians are still mapping. His grandfather on the other side was Samuel Galton, a successful Quaker businessman. The combination produced, in Francis, a man who had both the intellectual framework of the Enlightenment and the practical energy of the commercial classes, a man who wanted to measure everything and then do something useful with the measurements. He was a child, prodigy of the kind that Victorian England produced in some numbers. Reading at 2, Greek at 5. By his teens, he had ranged across mathematics, medicine, and natural history with the uncontrolled enthusiasm of a mind that had not yet found its subject. He studied medicine at Birmingham General Hospital and then at King's College London, then switched to mathematics at Cambridge, then left Cambridge without taking his degree when his father died and left him a substantial fortune. The fortune freed him. For the rest of his very long life, he died in 1911. At 89, Galton never had to work for a living, and he spent his freedom pursuing whatever questions interested him with a thoroughness that would have been impossible for a man with a salary and a job. He was, in the Victorian phrase, a man of independent means. In practice, this meant he was a man of unlimited curiosity and unlimited time. What he did with that time, across 60 years of productive scientific work, was staggering in its breadth. He invented the weather map, the system of isobars and fronts and symbols that is still used today. He invented the concept of correlation in statistics, without which modern science would look entirely different. He invented the questionnaire, the survey instrument that social scientists still use as their primary tool. He made significant contributions to psychology, to anthropology, to geography, to the design of scientific experiments. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was knighted. He received the Copley Medal, the highest honor the Royal Society could bestow, given to him in the same year it had previously been given to Darwin and Faraday. He was also, and this cannot be separated from the fingerprint story, cannot be set aside as irrelevant background, the founder of eugenics. The word itself is his. He coined it in 1883 from the Greek for well-born. The concept that human beings could be improved through selective breeding, that the hereditary qualities of a population could be deliberately managed to produce better outcomes, was one that Galton developed over decades and pursued with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything else. He believed, deeply and sincerely, that the greatest service a scientist could perform for humanity was to understand the mechanisms of heredity and to apply that understanding to the improvement of the human species. The consequences of this belief, as it was taken up and applied by others in the 20th century, were catastrophic. The eugenics movement that Galton inspired became, in the hands of governments and ideologues who were less careful and less humane than its founder, one of the most terrible pseudoscientific frameworks in modern history. This is part of Galton's legacy, and it needs to be said plainly, but it also needs to be understood in the context of what Galton was actually trying to do, which was something more limited and more specific than what his successors made of it. He was trying to understand heredity. He wanted to know which human characteristics were passed from parents to children, how they were transmitted, what the patterns of inheritance looked like across generations. This was a genuine scientific question, and the tools he developed to answer it correlation, the questionnaire, the systematic collection of data about human characteristics were genuine scientific tools that outlasted the ideological framework he built them to serve. Fingerprints were part of this project, but they turned out to be something else as well, something more interesting, more practically useful, and more lasting than anything Galton had originally intended. In 1884, 2 years before he became seriously interested in fingerprints, Galton opened his anthropometric laboratory at the International Health Exhibition in South Kensington. The idea was straightforward. Charge members of the public a small fee, 3p to have 17 measurements taken of their body: height, weight, arm span, strength of grip, reaction time, keenness of sight, hearing, color sense. The measurements were recorded on a card, and the card given to the visitor as a receipt, a personal document containing their precise physical data, which most people found genuinely interesting since this kind of systematic self-measurement was not otherwise available to them. For Galton, the 3p was almost irrelevant. What he wanted was the data. By the time the laboratory closed its original exhibition run and reopened at the South Kensington Museum in a permanent location, Galton had collected physical measurements on thousands of people, the most comprehensive dataset of human physical variation that had ever been assembled in one place. It was here, in this context, that fingerprints entered the picture. Galton had been interested in fingerprints since at least 1880, when a former colleague named William Herschel wrote to him from India with a startling claim. Herschel had been using fingerprints as a form of identification in Bengal for more than 20 years. requiring illiterate workers and pensioners to mark their contracts and identity documents with the impression of their right hand, rather than the traditional signature, because a handprint was harder to repudiate than a mark and harder to forge. He had, in the process of this administrative practice, accumulated what he believed was strong evidence that fingerprints were both unique and permanent, that they did not change over a person's lifetime, and that no two people's fingerprints were identical. Galton found this fascinating. And so, quietly and methodically, he added fingerprinting to the menu of measurements at his laboratory and began to collect. The fingerprint cards from Galton's collection are not large objects. They are approximately the size of a postcard, stiff cardstock, white or cream, with ruled spaces for the identifying information at the top and a series of ink squares below where each fingertip was pressed and rolled. The ink impressions on a good card are extraordinarily clear. The ridges show with the precision of a printed circuit, the loops rising and falling and turning, the whorls spiraling inward, the arches building and subsiding, every detail captured in black ink on white card, with a faithfulness that a camera of the period could not have matched. You can look at one of Galton's fingerprint cards and see every ridge, every bifurcation, every ending point, every pore. The human finger, pressed carefully onto card, is its own printing instrument of remarkable resolution. Galton was meticulous about the quality of his impressions. He wrote extensive notes on technique on the right amount of ink, the right pressure, the right way to roll the finger to capture the full pattern, rather than just the center of the fingertip. He trained his assistants. He examined each card after it was taken and rejected poor impressions, asking the subject to repeat the procedure. He wanted the data to be good, because bad data was worse than no data at all. Over 20 years, from the mid-1880s until shortly before his death in 1911, he collected 8,000 sets of fingerprints. Most of these were from the visitors to his laboratory, but not all. As his reputation in this specific field grew, samples were sent to him from correspondents around the world. Scientists who had read his work and wanted to contribute to his database. Colonial administrators like Herschel who had their own collections. Missionaries in distant countries who had taken fingerprints of local populations. All of this material arrived in the mail, in envelopes and packages, and was added to the files. Among 8,000 people, some were notable. And it is in these notable cases that the collection becomes genuinely extraordinary, not just as a scientific dataset, but as a historical artifact. Galton had the fingerprints of his cousin, Charles Darwin. Not taken personally, Darwin died in 1882, before the systematic collection was fully underway, but obtained through correspondence with members of the Darwin family who, understanding the scientific significance of what Galton was doing, provided ink impressions from personal papers and documents. The fingerprints of the man who changed biology forever, preserved on a card in a collection dedicated to understanding human heredity. He had fingerprints from members of the British royal family, not from the monarchs themselves, who were not about to turn up at South Kensington to have their fingers inked, but from several members of the extended royal household who participated in the laboratory's public measurement sessions. These cards were noted in Galton's records with characteristic discretion not named explicitly in the published catalog, but identifiable through the cross-referencing of dates and the surviving correspondence. He had the fingerprints of soldiers returned from various colonial campaigns, men whose hands had done extraordinary things, whose fingers had held rifles in African heat and Afghan cold, whose prints were now pressed calmly onto white cards in a quiet laboratory in South Kensington. He had the fingerprints of artists, of physicians, of engineers who had built bridges across rivers in countries Galton had never visited. He had the fingerprints of at least 3 convicted criminals whose cases he had been permitted to access through his connections with the Home Office. And he had the fingerprints of children, lots of them. Because one of the central questions Galton was trying to answer was whether fingerprints were stable across a lifetime, whether the patterns that appeared on a child's fingers would still be recognizable on those same fingers decades later. He took fingerprints from children and then, when he could, tracked them down years afterward and took them again. The results, in every case where he managed to complete the comparison, were unambiguous. The patterns were identical. The child and the adult had exactly the same fingerprints. The ridges had grown, the fingers had grown, but the pattern, the relative positions of the loops and whorls and arches, the specific arrangement that made each fingerprint unique was unchanged. There is something quietly wonderful about this. The fact that your fingerprints today are the same as your fingerprints at birth means that every impression you have ever left on anything, every glass, every door, every surface your fingers have touched in your entire life records the same pattern. You have been leaving your unique mark on the world since the moment you arrived in it, without knowing it, without being asked, in a language made of loops and whorls that Galton spent 20 years learning to read. Among 8,000 cards, there were anomalies, fingerprints that defied the categories Galton was developing, patterns that sat uncomfortably between the classification groups he had established, impressions that made him write extended notes in the margins of the cards about what he was seeing and why he could not quite place it. There was the card from a man who had lost the tip of one finger in an industrial accident years before the finger had regrown partially, the skin closing over the wound, and the fingerprint on the regrown portion was not the same as the original pattern, but was not entirely different either. It was a modified version, like a sentence with a word replaced. The grammar still recognizable, but the specific word changed. This fascinated Galton enormously. It suggested that the pattern was not simply determined by the specific ridges that happened to form, it was encoded in something deeper, something that survived even significant physical damage. There was the card from a set of identical twins. Galton had been particularly eager to collect these, for the obvious reason that if fingerprints were hereditary, identical twins who shared all their genetic material should have very similar fingerprints. They did not. The twins' fingerprints were clearly from the same family, sharing the same general type and many of the same large-scale features, but they were not identical. The fine detail, the precise location of every bifurcation and ending point was different. This was one of the most important results Galton ever obtained, though he was not entirely sure what to make of it. It meant that fingerprints were not purely hereditary. Something else was involved in their formation, something that happened in the womb, something that produced variation, even between genetically identical individuals. We now know what that something is. Fingerprint patterns are determined partly by genetics and partly by the random physical pressures and fluid flows that occur in the developing fetus during the period when the ridges form somewhere between 10 and 17 weeks of development. Even identical twins, starting from the same genetic blueprint, experience slightly different physical conditions in the womb, and those differences produce different fingerprints. The pattern is partly written by the genes and partly improvised by chaos. Every fingerprint is unique precisely because it is the product of both heredity and randomness, both the fixed and the unpredictable. Galton understood the result. The twins had different fingerprints, but did not yet have the developmental biology to understand why. He noted it carefully, cataloged it, and moved on, adding it to the accumulating body of evidence that fingerprints were unique and permanent without fully understanding the mechanism that made them so. Then there were the truly strange cases. A woman whose fingerprints on both hands were almost entirely arches, the rarest pattern type, which normally constitutes only about 5% of all fingerprints, but which in her case covered 8 of her 10 fingers. She was, statistically, an extraordinary outlier, and Galton took her fingerprints 3 times to make sure he was not making an error. He was not. Her hands were genuinely, improbably covered in arches. He kept her card in a separate folder marked Notable Specimens. There was the elderly sailor whose decades at sea had worn his fingerprints almost smooth. The constant friction of ropes and rigging and salt water and canvas had abraded the ridges to a point where the impressions barely registered on the card. Galton had to use his finest ink and his most careful technique to get any impression at all. The resulting card, when you look at it, shows ghost fingerprints, the pattern still barely visible, a suggestion of whorls and loops beneath a surface worn to near blankness by a lifetime of work. It is one of the most evocative objects in the collection, a man's entire working life written on his fingertips and then worn almost away. Collecting 8,000 fingerprint cards is one thing. Making sense of them is another. Galton's central scientific problem was classification. He understood early on that fingerprints were unique and permanent. Herschel's evidence was compelling, and his own collecting confirmed it at every turn. But uniqueness by itself is not very useful. If every fingerprint is different from every other, how do you search a collection of 8,000 for a match? You cannot look at a new fingerprint and immediately know which of 8,000 cards it corresponds to, any more than you can hear a new name and immediately know which of 8,000 people in a room it belongs to. What you need is a filing system. A way of sorting the fingerprints into categories that allows you to narrow the search from 8,000 possibilities to a manageable few, and then to make the final identification by direct comparison. The fingerprint, in other words, needs an index. Galton understood this perfectly, and he spent years trying to create one. His approach was to identify the fundamental types of fingerprint pattern and to develop a notation system that could describe any fingerprint in terms of those types. He settled on 3 primary categories, which remain the basis of fingerprint classification to this day. The arch, a simple curve that rises and falls without turning back on itself. The loop, a curve that rises, turns back on itself, and exits on the same side it entered. The whorl, a closed curve that spirals or circles. Within these 3 types, he identified subtypes and variations: the plain arch and the tented arch, the radial loop and the ulnar loop, the plain whorl and the central pocket whorl, and the double loop whorl. He developed a notation system that could describe a set of 10 fingerprints in a compact code, a string of letters and numbers that captured the essential character of each print, and then he hit a wall. The problem was granularity. The 3 primary types, arch, loop, whorl, were clear and easy to assign, but they were not fine-grained enough to make the system truly useful. If you classify 10 fingerprints each as simply one of 3 types, the number of possible combinations is about 60,000. For a collection of 8,000, that would mean an average of about 1 in 8 cards in each category. Still too many to make rapid identification practical. What was needed was a finer classification, a way of subdividing the categories based on more detailed features of the pattern. Galton could see that this was necessary. He could see, looking at his cards, that there were details specific ridge formations, counting the ridges between fixed points, the positions of specific features he called minutiae that could provide the finer discrimination he needed. He could not make it work, not for lack of trying. He spent years on the classification problem. His 1,892 book, Fingerprints, still one of the essential texts in the history of the field, contains an extensive treatment of the classification question, with multiple proposed systems and their limitations honestly described. He knew what he was trying to do. He could not figure out how to do it systematically enough to make a practical filing system. The person who solved the classification problem that Galton could not solve was a Scottish physician named Henry Faulds, except that he did not quite solve it either. And the story of who deserves credit for what is one of the more tangled priority disputes in the history of science, and the person who actually implemented a working fingerprint classification system, the one that police forces around the world would eventually adopt, was not Faulds and was not Galton, but a man named Edward Henry, who had been working as a police commissioner in Bengal and who read Galton's book, understood the problem, and in 1896 published a classification system, the Henry classification system, that was simultaneously simpler and more powerful than anything Galton had proposed. The Henry system was elegant in the way that good solutions to hard problems are elegant. It divided the fingerprints into primary categories using a numerical formula based on the presence or absence of whorls, and then subdivided within those categories using additional features. It was not theoretically perfect. No fingerprint classification system is theoretically perfect, because the real world of fingerprints is messier than any category system can fully capture, but it was practically workable, and that was what mattered. Henry became commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London in 1901 and introduced his classification system to Scotland Yard. Within a few years, the Fingerprint Bureau at Scotland Yard had replaced the older Bertillon system of body measurements, a system that Galton himself had helped develop, and that had seemed, until fingerprints arrived, like the future of criminal identification, and was making identifications that would have been impossible by any other method. Galton watched all of this with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction because the thing he had spent 20 years arguing for, that fingerprints were unique, permanent, and identifiable, had been vindicated beyond any doubt. Frustration because the practical system that had vindicated it was not his. He had prepared the ground. Someone else had planted the tree. In the history of science, there is a particular kind of contribution that is easy to undervalue, the contribution that makes a subsequent contribution possible. Galton did not invent fingerprint identification. He did not build the first workable classification system. He was not responsible for the first criminal conviction based on fingerprint evidence. But without him, none of these things would have happened when they did. What he proved, rigorously and permanently, was the two foundational facts without which fingerprint identification is meaningless: that fingerprints are unique and that they are permanent. The uniqueness claim required the statistical analysis that was Galton's particular genius. He calculated, with the mathematical precision that characterized his best work, the probability that any two people would share identical fingerprints. His estimate was approximately 1 in 64 billion. The world population in 1892 was about 1.6 billion people. By Galton's calculation, the probability that any two people alive at that moment shared fingerprints was effectively zero, and the probability that any two people who had ever lived or ever would live shared fingerprints was only slightly less, effectively zero. The permanence claim required the longitudinal data, the fingerprints taken from the same individuals years or decades apart. Galton pursued these comparisons with the patience of a scientist who understood that a single data point proves nothing, and that only a consistent pattern across multiple cases is scientifically convincing. He found the pattern. Every comparison he made between early and late fingerprints from the same individual showed the same result. The patterns were identical, aged by the growth of the finger, but not changed in any feature that mattered for identification. He had proven something that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely unknown before he proved it. You are your fingerprints. They do not change. They cannot be disguised. They follow you from birth to death, marking everything you touch, with a signature that is yours alone. Here is the thing that makes the Galton fingerprint story genuinely puzzling. He knew, he had proven, to his own satisfaction, and to the satisfaction of the scientific community, that fingerprints were unique and permanent. He understood, clearly, that this made them, in principle, the most powerful identification tool ever developed, more reliable than any physical description, more permanent than any photograph, more difficult to forge than any signature or document. He had spent 20 years and considerable personal fortune building the database and doing the analysis. And then he did not quite finish. The classification problem was partly to blame. Without a working filing system, the database of 8,000 cards was impressive as a scientific demonstration, but not practically useful for the kind of rapid identification that law enforcement needed. You could prove, given time, and a specific comparison to make, that a particular fingerprint matched a particular card. You could not quickly search the full collection for an unknown print, but there was something else. Galton was, at bottom, a scientist rather than an engineer or an administrator. He was interested in fingerprints as a key to the question of heredity, as a measurable human characteristic whose patterns of inheritance could tell him something about how traits were passed from parents to children. The criminal identification application was, for him, a demonstration of scientific importance rather than the primary point. He did not have the police administrator's instinct for practical systems and organizational implementation. He also, by the late 1890s, was in his 70s and increasingly occupied with other things. He was writing the book that would become his most sustained statement on eugenics. He was involved in the foundation of a biometric laboratory at University College London, the institution that would eventually bear his name. He was corresponding with the next generation of scientists who were taking the statistical tools he had developed and applying them to biology and social science in ways that kept him busy and engaged. The fingerprint collection sat in its boxes at the laboratory. It was consulted by Galton himself and by the occasional visiting researcher. It was referenced in his book. It was cited by Henry when Henry built his classification system. But it was not what Galton had perhaps imagined it becoming when he first started pressing strangers' fingers onto ink pads in a South Kensington laboratory in the 1880s. While Galton was failing to complete his classification system, the world was beginning to provide demonstrations of why it mattered. In 1892, in the Argentine province of Buenos Aires, a woman named Francisca Rojas was accused of murdering her 2 children. She denied it. There was no witness. The evidence was circumstantial and contested. The investigating officer, Eduardo Alvarez, was familiar with the emerging science of fingerprint identification and examined the crime scene carefully. On a doorpost in the house, he found a bloody thumbprint. He took an impression of the thumbprint and compared it to the fingerprints of Francisca Rojas. They matched. Confronted with this evidence the first time in history that a fingerprint comparison had been used in a criminal investigation, Rojas confessed. News of this case reached London. It reached Scotland Yard. It reached the scientific community. And it dramatically accelerated the timeline for the adoption of fingerprint identification by police forces, because here, finally, was not a theoretical demonstration of the system's power, but a real case with a real murderer identified by a real fingerprint. Galton heard about it. He was pleased. He noted it in his correspondence. He did not, however, dramatically accelerate his own work on the classification problem. He was 70 years old, and he was working at the pace of a man who has spent his life on long-term projects and who trusts that the important things will eventually get done. They did. Just not by him. To understand the urgency that fingerprints eventually addressed, it helps to understand what had come before them. Alphonse Bertillon was a French police official who, in 1879, developed a system of criminal identification based on the precise measurement of 11 body parts: the length of the head, the width of the head, the length of the left foot, the length of the left middle finger, and so on. The system was based on the statistical argument that the combination of 11 precise measurements was sufficiently unique to distinguish one person from any other. Bertillonage, as the system was called, was adopted by police forces around the world, including Scotland Yard. It was celebrated as the solution to the identification problem, the tool that would allow police forces to definitively identify repeat offenders who gave false names, which was a serious and persistent problem in an era when there was no other reliable way to prove who someone was. It worked, more or less, for a while. And then, in 1903, it produced a failure so spectacular that it effectively ended the system's credibility. In that year, a man named Will West arrived at the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, to begin serving a sentence. The Bertillon measurements were taken, as they were for every incoming prisoner. The measurements were checked against the files, and the files showed that a man named William West, with essentially identical Bertillon measurements, was already serving a sentence at Leavenworth. 2 different men, nearly identical names. Essentially identical Bertillon measurements. The system had failed at its fundamental purpose. The prison authorities, perplexed, turned to the fingerprint cards that had recently been introduced as a secondary identification tool. The fingerprints were completely different. The 2 Wests were, apparently, unrelated, though their resemblance to each other was striking enough that some historians have suggested they might have been twins who were separated at birth and never knew of each other's existence. The Will West case was the end of Bertillonage as a serious identification system. Within a few years, fingerprinting had replaced it everywhere. The system that Galton had spent 20 years building the scientific case for had arrived definitively as the standard tool of criminal identification. Galton was 81 years old. He had lived to see it. Francis Galton died in January 1911. He had been in poor health for several years. The vigorous traveler and experimenter of his middle age had given way, as it always does, to a slower and more contemplative old man, working from an armchair, corresponding by letter, receiving visitors who came to pay their respects to a figure who was, by then, a monument of Victorian science. He left his estate to University College London, together with a bequest to establish a chair of eugenics, the Galton Professorship, which exists to this day under a different name, the subject having been quietly redefined as genetics and statistical science as the implications of eugenics became impossible to defend. His papers, his instruments, and his collections went with the estate. The fingerprint collection, 8,000 cards, 20 years of data, the largest database of fingerprint patterns ever assembled by a private individual, went to University College as part of this bequest. For some years, it remained an active research resource. The biometric laboratory that Galton had helped establish, and that his successor, Carl Pearson, continued to develop, used the collection as a teaching and research tool. Students learned to classify fingerprints. Researchers published papers using the data. The collection was maintained and consulted. Then, gradually, it became less relevant as a research tool. The questions that had motivated Galton, the question of whether fingerprint patterns were heritable, the question of whether they varied systematically across populations or races, had been answered, and the answers had not been what Galton hoped. The patterns were not significantly heritable in the ways that would have been scientifically interesting to the eugenics program. The variation across populations was real, but not of the kind that could support the ideological conclusions that some of Galton's successors wanted to draw. The collection moved into storage. It became an archive rather than a laboratory resource, something that was there, that was maintained, that had historical value, but was no longer the center of active scientific work. The Galton collection is currently held at University College London, split between the UCL archives and the Galton Laboratory. The fingerprint cards, or a significant portion of them, since the collection has had a complicated archival history and some material has been lost or separated over the century, since Galton's death are accessible to researchers, they are remarkable to look at. The cards have yellowed slightly with age, but the ink impressions are still extraordinarily clear. The ridge detail is as sharp as the day the cards were made. You can look at a fingerprint taken in 1888 and see every line, every bifurcation, every ending point with complete clarity. The people who pressed their fingers onto these cards are dead, all of them, certainly, given that even the youngest would be well over 100 years old. But their fingerprints are as vivid as they were on the day they visited Galton's laboratory. Researchers have used the collection in several ways. Historians of science use it to understand how Galton worked the cards, with their annotations and their filing systems and their occasional marginal notes, reveal the process of scientific thinking in a way that published papers cannot. Statisticians have revisited Galton's analysis using modern methods. Geneticists have used the collection to study the heritability of fingerprint patterns with techniques that were not available in Galton's time, and forensic scientists have used it for training because a collection of 8,000 clearly printed cards from known individuals, assembled by the man who established the scientific basis of fingerprint identification, is an extraordinarily valuable teaching resource. The collection that Galton built as a scientific database became, among other things, a kind of textbook, a physical library of human individuality that students can hold in their hands and examine. There is one aspect of the fingerprint collection that Galton never resolved to his own satisfaction, and that subsequent researchers have not entirely resolved either. He wanted to know if fingerprint patterns ran in families, not in the way that eye color runs in families, or height, or the tendency towards certain diseases, not a simple dominant recessive inheritance pattern, but some form of family resemblance, some tendency for children to have fingerprint patterns similar to those of their parents, for siblings to share more features than would be expected by chance. He collected family sets specifically for this purpose: cards from parents and children, cards from siblings, cards from grandparents and grandchildren. He analyzed these sets with the statistical methods he had developed, the correlation coefficient that bears his name. Applied now to fingerprint data rather than to the height and weight measurements he had originally developed it for. The results were inconclusive. There was some evidence of family resemblance in the general type of pattern. Children of parents with whorls tended slightly toward whorls. Children of parents with loops tended slightly toward loops. But the correlation was weak, much weaker than for any of the physical traits Galton had measured in his anthropometric laboratory. The fine detail, the specific ridge arrangements that made each fingerprint unique, showed no familial correlation at all. This frustrated Galton because it seemed to undercut his larger project. If fingerprints were not strongly heritable, they could not serve as a window into the mechanisms of heredity. They could serve as a tool of identification, which was valuable. But they could not tell him what he most wanted to know, which was how the characteristics of parents were transmitted to their children. The answer to this question, the mechanism of heredity, would come from a direction Galton had not expected, from the rediscovery in 1900 of Gregor Mendel's work on peas, which had been sitting largely unnoticed in the scientific literature since 1866. Mendel's laws of inheritance, and the chromosomal theory that built on them provided the mechanistic account of heredity that Galton had been looking for all his life. They also explained, eventually, why fingerprints were only weakly heritable, because they were determined not just by genes, but by the complex environmental conditions of fetal development, by the interaction of genetic instruction with physical contingency, by the unique circumstances of each individual's formation in the womb. Galton did not live to see the full flowering of genetics. He died in 1911, a decade before the chromosome theory was fully worked out. He had built the statistical tools that would make modern genetics possible, had asked the right questions, had collected the data, and had been answered, in the end, by a different language than the one he had been speaking. Galton's fingerprint collection is, on one level, a straightforward story of Victorian scientific enterprise. A rich man with a question, a laboratory, 20 years of patient data collection, and a result that was partly triumphant and partly frustrating. The uniqueness and permanence of fingerprints were proved. The classification system that would make them practically useful was left for someone else. The heredity question that motivated the whole project was answered in ways that Galton found unsatisfying. But there is a larger story inside the smaller one. And it is the story that makes Galton's fingerprint collection genuinely fascinating rather than merely historically interesting. The story is about identity, about what it means to be a unique individual, to be this person and not any other. About the question of how we prove who we are, how we establish that the person standing before you now is the same person who stood before you last year, or 10 years ago, or at the scene of a crime. These questions seem simple. They are not. For most of human history, the answer to the question of who you are was whoever you say you are, and whoever other people who know you say you are. Identity was a social fact established by witnesses, by documents, by the communities that recognized you. It was robust within those communities and fragile outside them. A man who moved to a new city could claim any past he liked, because there was no one to contradict him. A criminal who served his sentence and returned to crime could give a false name with confidence, because there was no way to prove otherwise. Galton understood that fingerprints dissolved this problem. They provided an identity that was independent of community, independent of witnesses, independent of documents and declarations. Your fingerprints are you, in a way that your name is not, your appearance is not, even your face is not. They are the one thing about you that cannot be altered by time, injury, surgery, or deliberate misrepresentation. They are the physical signature of your individuality, written into your skin before you were born. The implications of this were vast, and Galton saw most of them, though he could not have seen all of them, because some were barely imaginable in 1892, and some have only become reality in the 21st century. He saw criminal identification, which was the most immediate application. He saw the possibility of a national registry, a database of everyone's fingerprints that could be used to establish identity in any circumstance. He saw, more dimly, applications in civil law, in contracts, in the verification of identity for financial and administrative purposes. He did not see the smartphone that would be unlocked by a fingerprint scan. He did not see the border crossing where your fingers would be pressed onto a glass plate and compared in seconds against a database of millions. He did not see the crime scene where a partial print would be lifted, enhanced, and run through an automated matching system that would identify a suspect from a database containing the fingerprints of every person ever arrested in a given country. But the system that makes all of those things possible is built on the foundation that Galton laid. The 8,000 cards in the laboratory at South Kensington were the first stones of a structure that now encompasses billions of people. And what of the 8,000 strangers who pressed their fingers onto the ink pad in Galton's laboratory? They came for different reasons. Some were curious. Galton's reputation was such that visiting his laboratory was, for the scientifically inclined, an experience worth having. Some came because they had heard about the anthropometric measurements and wanted the novelty of having their body data recorded on a card. Some, particularly the children, came because their parents brought them, understanding dimly that they were participating in something that mattered, not knowing exactly what. None of them, almost certainly, understood the full implications of what they were contributing to. The idea that the ink impression of their fingertip on a card in a Kensington laboratory was the precursor of a system that would eventually reach into every corner of human life that would be used to catch murderers and to unlock phones and to process visa applications and to verify identity at borders was simply not available to them. They were participating in a scientist's experiment. They got their card and they went home. Their names are on those cards, most of them. Their occupations, their ages, the date they visited the laboratory. These details have a particular poignancy when you encounter them, because they remind you that behind every data point in Galton's enormous collection was a specific, irreplaceable human being with a life that extended far beyond the moment of having their fingers inked. The retired soldier, the school teacher, the children who are now, certainly, long dead. All of them left something of themselves in that laboratory, something so small and so specific that it could be read with a magnifying glass, something that is, in the most literal sense, theirs alone. Your fingerprints were formed before you were born, in a process that combined your genetic inheritance with the random physical conditions of your existence in the womb. They are neither entirely determined nor entirely accidental. They are you and the universe collaborating, without your knowledge or consent, to produce a pattern that has never existed before and will never exist again. Galton spent 20 years collecting these patterns and still could not quite make them tell him what he most wanted to know. What they told him instead, what they will always tell anyone who looks carefully enough, is that each person is genuinely, irreducibly unique. Not in the vague sense that people mean when they say it at graduation ceremonies. In the specific, measurable, mathematically demonstrable sense that no two sets of fingerprints in the history of the world have ever been the same. Francis Galton's fingerprint collection sits in the archives at University College London, in acid-free boxes, in a climate-controlled room. The cards are there, the ink impressions are clear. The names of the 8,000 strangers are legible on their labels. Galton himself is buried in Claverdon, Warwickshire, in the churchyard of a village church, beneath a stone that notes his scientific achievements without attempting to list them. His portrait hangs at University College. His name is on a building, on a professorship, on the statistical concept, the Galton board, the device that demonstrates the normal distribution by letting balls fall through a grid of pegs that bears witness to his most lasting contribution to science, the fingerprint classification problem that defeated him, solved by Henry 8 years before Galton died. The criminal identification system that he had laid the groundwork for was in operation at Scotland Yard while he was still alive. He attended the hearings of the Belper Committee, the governmental inquiry that recommended the adoption of fingerprinting by British police forces in 1901, and gave evidence. He was present, in some sense, at the birth of the system he had made possible. The question he most wanted to answer, the heredity question, the question of whether and how fingerprint patterns were passed from parents to children, was eventually answered, partly by researchers who came after him. Fingerprint patterns are heritable in the general type. The tendency toward loops versus whorls has a genetic component, but the specific details that make each fingerprint unique are determined by the physical conditions of development, and those conditions are not heritable. The pattern type is partly in the genes. The specific pattern is in the chaos. This was not the answer Galton wanted. It did not serve the project he had spent his life on, but it was true, and it was arrived at by means of the statistical methods and the empirical approach that he had developed. And there is a kind of satisfaction in that the tools surviving their inventors' purposes, continuing to do good work in service of questions he never asked. The 8,000 cards are patient in their boxes. Each one holds a complete and irreducible human being, reduced to 10 ink impressions and a few lines of identifying information. Each one is a small piece of evidence for something that Galton proved and that we have been building on ever since. Every person is unique. The proof is in the ridges. It always was.